Okay, so Napoleon the Third, the British and the Spanish land in Veracruz, which was the traditional port for invasions. That's Cortez had landed near there in the early 1500s. Winfield Scott had landed there in the Mexican-American War. Actually, Americans occupied Veracruz in 1913 as well, but that's another course. And they start moving inland towards Mexico City. Very quickly, the British and the Spanish smell a rat, and they make a deal with the Mexican government, and they're out of there. They don't want to get involved in overthrowing a Republican government. Juarez. It's not that they're supportive of Juarez, but it's just this is just a little bit too much for them. But I don't want to give them too much credit because the first country to recognize Maximilian, anyway, one of the first countries, when he is crowned the Emperor of Mexico in 1864, is Great Britain. So they're definitely working. They're definitely supportive of Napoleon the Third, although they're not going to go to war against Juarez. Okay. Now, at the end of the last podcast, I was talking about what is Mexico's neighbor, the Confederacy. And you would think, anyway, that the Confederacy, these folks up until like 18 months before had been part of the United States. They had been very vocal proponents of the Monroe Doctrine. Stay out of the Americas, Europe. You would think that Confederate officials would be concerned that Napoleon the Third was sending an army into Mexico, and that Napoleon the Third was going to establish an emperor in Mexico, Maximilian, his puppet. But what happened is, and this is what my research has shown, is that Confederate diplomats actually meet with Napoleon III face to face, a guy by the name of John Slidell. He's the Confederate envoy in Paris. And he says to Napoleon III, "We're okay with you overthrowing Juarez." The Confederates knew what was going on. They knew what Napoleon III's game plan was. Everybody knew. It wasn't. If it was a secret, it was a very poorly disguised secret. It's very clear that that most of the world knew that Napoleon III was going to try to establish Maximilian as the Emperor of Mexico. So the point I'm making here is the Confederate government, instead of opposing this, actually signals its support for Napoleon III. And Slidell says, any enemy of you is an enemy of us. So the Confederacy is not going to send weapons or troops into Mexico to overthrow Juarez. But importantly, the Confederacy is not going to send weapons and troops to support Juarez either against this invasion. In fact, just the reverse. The Confederates, with a wink and a nod, and even more than that, basically tell the French, "We don't care what you do in Mexico. We're fine with it." Okay. Now the question is, why is the Confederacy okay with this? Why is the Confederacy okay with the French, a French emperor, trying to establish a king or an emperor in Mexico City? Weren't the Confederates, weren't they democratic? Didn't they have the facade of a democratic government? Many Confederates had been very pro-Monroe Doctrine. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is pretty obvious. The Confederates were desperate for the French to recognize the Confederacy or the Confederate States of America as an independent nation. This was a huge deal for the Confederacy. As we had talked about, the Confederacy just assumed, or Southerners, I should say, white Southerners, before the Civil War, they just assumed that England and France would recognize the independence of the South if the South broke from the Union. Of course, the reason for this was the importance of cotton to the economies of England and to the economy of France. they're very disappointed when this doesn't happen. King Cotton does not play out at all like they had anticipated. And I think you guys have a good understanding of this because of the papers that I graded. I think all of them mentioned Hammond's King Cotton speech and quoted it. So huge disappointment. Why doesn't Europe get involved? I'll talk about this more in a later lecture. But England doesn't want to get involved in or by recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation because Lincoln promised he'd go to war with with England and France if they did recognize the Confederate States as an independent country and all the legitimacy that brought. And the other thing to remember, and this again speaks to the continental aspects of the 1860s, the United States basically threatened that it would invade Canada if Great Britain recognized the Confederacy. So what happens is in the 1860s, the British actually send thousands of troops to Canada just to stop such a thing from happening. So England didn't have all the cards to play when it came to this. The other thing is the British working classes, and Doyle, you'll read about this in Doyle. The British working classes, although they were really getting hurt, huge amounts of unemployment, almost 50% in the mills of central England by 1863 because of what they called the cotton famine. So the English working classes, a very significant proportion of whom worked manufacturing southern cotton, although they're getting killed economically, although there's very, very high unemployment among the English working classes, generally they're very supportive of the Union versus the Confederacy, especially after Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The English working class, like the other European liberals, couldn't understand why Lincoln wasn't making the war a war of emancipation. But this question became moot after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. At that point, the Civil War becomes a war of abolition, which is, for Lincoln, one of the great corollary advantages of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. That he gains the support of liberals in Europe and working class liberals especially. So even though democracy, especially in England, even though it wasn't these working class, men and women, but specifically men, very, very few of them could vote. Nonetheless, there would have been so much upheaval. There would have been so much anger if the British government, which was sympathetic to the Confederacy, if it had recognized the Confederacy, that it would have caused real political problems in Great Britain, and to a lesser extent in France as well. Okay, so to go back to the Confederacy is very disappointed that England doesn't recognize the Confederate States of America as an independent country. So they look to France. That's their plan B. France is, okay, if England won't recognize us, maybe France will. The problem is that it was a bit of a catch-22 for the Southerners because Napoleon the Third made it very clear that he would not recognize the Confederacy unless England did, and England never did. But the Confederates, I have to say, I think were pretty dumb diplomatically. They weren't very, very savvy diplomats. Lincoln's Corps of Diplomats was much more efficient. And so the Confederates never could really figure out Napoleon the Third. And he totally plays them throughout the Civil War. And there's really no doubt about it. And I just wrote an article, it's coming out early next year, where I talk about how Napoleon the Third played the Confederacy. So Confederate diplomats are desperate to have Napoleon III recognized the Confederacy, maybe use his navy to break up the blockade, that kind of a thing. And Napoleon III was happy to play along with them because the Confederates were saying, hey, we're looking the other way in Mexico. So the point here is that one of the reasons that the Confederacy did not protest against what the French were doing in Mexico is that they hoped their acquiescence to the French intervention in Mexico would persuade Napoleon the Third to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation on the world stage, which would have been a huge victory for the South if that had been possible, or if that had happened, which it doesn't. The other thing is, Napoleon the Third is actually quite sympathetic to the Confederacy, much more so than he is to the Union. And one of the things he wants is he wants the Confederacy to succeed, because if you think about it, the Confederacy would have been a big bulwark between the Union and Mexico. If the Confederacy had broken had been successful as an independent nation, it would have created a huge buffer between the truncated United States, right? If the South had managed to win the Civil War, and French occupied Mexico. So it was in Napoleon III's interest for the Confederacy to win the Civil War. Also, Lincoln makes it very clear that he's quite angry. And he really opposes what the French are doing in Mexico. But he also makes it very clear that he can't do anything about it until the Civil War is over. So Napoleon III is very, very sympathetic to the Confederates, but he's not willing to risk war with the Lincoln administration by unilaterally recognizing the Confederacy, which he knew would happen, that if he recognized the Confederacy, this would lead to war with the Union, and that's not something that he really wanted. Why would he provoke an unnecessary war? But the key thing here is that Napoleon III is very, very sympathetic to the Confederacy, and the Confederates, for their part, look the other way. They wink. They indicate to Napoleon III that they're okay with his invasion of Mexico. They're okay with the overthrow of Benito Juarez, the constitutionally elected president of Mexico. They're okay with Napoleon III installing Maximilian as a French puppet in Mexico. So this is a pretty striking moment in the history of the Civil War, that the Confederacy aligns itself with the European old guard that is attempting to reestablish monarchical government in the Western Hemisphere. One of the ways you might see this is the Confederates are supporting this counter-revolution against 1776, this counter-revolution against the idea of democratic government in the Western Hemisphere. And the Confederates are going along with Napoleon III. They're playing along with this. And this is something that I think historians have missed. They've missed the complicity of the Confederacy in working with Napoleon III in establishing a monarchy in neighboring Mexico. And to me, it makes the Confederacy look even worse than it normally does, given its support of slavery. The Confederates align themselves with the anti-democratic forces that are globally trying to undermine democracy.